Dust does not fall in the Bannerman Valley. It hangs. It waits, same as the man who owns every acre beneath it. Colt Bannerman has not shaken a stranger's hand in 3 years. He does not need to. His cattle do not ask him to trust them. His fences do not lie to him, and his silence has never once cost him money. Men ride out from the capital in fine coats, waving bank drafts thick enough to choke a mule, and Colt sends every one of them back down the road before their coffee gets cold. Rich rancher, they call him behind his back. Refused again, they say, shaking their heads. Colt has heard both, and neither one moves him an inch. He built this hardness one brick at a time. Starting the night his younger brother Thomas rode off this land and never rode back. Colt does not talk about that night. He has trained himself not to think about it either, mostly by never sitting still long enough for the thought to catch him. Catches him anyway. In the evening a storm rolls low and mean over the ridge, the kind of storm that turns a dirt road to soup and strands travelers who have no business being out. That is when a knock lands on his front door, soft, uncertain, and completely unwelcome. He opens it expecting a ranch hand. He finds a woman instead, soaked through, a leather bag clutched to her chest and a small child asleep against her shoulder. Colt tells her the road to town is that way. He tells her he does not take in strangers. He is already closing the door when she says one word that stops his hand cold. She says his brother's name. Not as a stranger would say a name she overheard once in a saloon. She says it the way a woman says the name of someone she loved. And in her open bag, tucked beside a folded blanket, Colt sees the corner of a deed he has not laid eyes on in years, one bearing a seal his own father pressed into wax before Colt was old enough to understand what it meant. Colt Bannerman built a fortress out of barbed wire and bitterness so that nothing from his past could ever reach him again. He never planned for his past to knock, holding a baby, in the middle of a storm, with proof in her hands that everything he believes about his own family might be a lie. If you want to see whether Colt Bannerman opens that door all the way, or shuts it forever, stay with me to the end. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going together. The Bannerman Ranch covers more ground than the eye can hold in a single look. Fences run for miles in every direction, strung tight and true, each post driven by Colt's own hands or by men he trusts to drive them the way he would. Nothing on this land moves without Colt knowing about it first. That is exactly how he wants it. He rides the north pasture at dawn most mornings, alone, because a ranch this size does not run itself and because he has never found much use for company. His foreman, Deke, learned years ago not to make small talk before noon. His cook learned the same lesson about supper. Colt is not cruel to the men who work for him. He pays fair, he feeds well, and he expects silence in return, and most of them are glad enough to give it. It was not always this way. There was a time Colt Bannerman laughed at the supper table, teased his younger brother about his terrible aim with a rifle, and believed the ranch would belong to both of them until they were old men sitting on the same porch. That time ended the night Thomas packed a single bag and rode off the property before sunrise, leaving nothing behind but a note Colt burned without reading twice. Word came later, through men who traded in rumors more than facts, that Thomas had died somewhere south, alone, without a name anyone bothered to carve into a stone. Colt took that word the way he takes everything now. He filed it away, he locked the door on it, and he went back to building fences. By mid-morning a rider comes up the drive in a coat too clean for ranch work, a man from a land syndicate out of the capital, offering a number that would make most ranchers in the valley weep with gratitude. Colt lets him finish his speech. He always lets them finish. Then he tells the man the same thing he has told every syndicate rider for 3 years running. This land isn't for sale. Wasn't for sale last year, isn't for sale this year, won't be for sale next year either. You can ride back and tell them that, and you can save yourself the trip out here in the future. The rider argues. They always argue. Colt does not raise his voice, because raising his voice has never once changed a man's mind, and it costs energy he would rather spend elsewhere. He simply waits, arms crossed, until the rider runs out of words and turns his horse back toward the Capitol Road. Deke watches the whole exchange from the corral fence, chewing a piece of straw. Man offered you enough money to buy 3 ranches this size. He says once the rider is well down the drive. Don't want 3 ranches, Colt says. Want this one. Same as I wanted it yesterday. Some men would call that stubborn. Some men would be right. Deke does not push further, because he has worked for Colt Bannerman long enough to know that stubbornness is not the whole story. There is a reason under the reason, something Colt buried the same year he buried his brother's memory, and no amount of money from the capital is ever going to dig it back up. Deke goes back to mending fences. Colt goes back to riding the line, alone, the way he prefers it, the way he has arranged his entire life to keep it. That evening, after the syndicate rider's dust has long settled and the hands have gone to their bunks, Colt rides out alone to the small fenced plot on the hill above the north pasture, where his father and mother lie side by side beneath plain stone markers. He comes here more than he tells anyone, though he never brings flowers and never says much once he arrives. Tonight he sits his horse at the fence a long while, looking down at his father's marker without dismounting. You'd have sold to nobody either, Colt says quietly, to no one who can answer him. Same as me, except I don't rightly know anymore if I'm holding this land the way you'd have wanted, or just holding on to it because letting go of anything else has already cost me too much. He does not linger long. He never does. But riding back down toward the house in the last gray light of evening, he lets himself remember, just for a moment, the morning Thomas left. It was barely dawn, the sky still more black than blue, when Colt heard the stable door and came out in his nightshirt to find his younger brother already mounted, a single bag tied behind his saddle. Thomas would not look at him straight. "Where do you think you're riding at this hour?" Colt had said, more amused than worried, not yet understanding what he was watching. "Away," Thomas said. "Just away, Colt. Don't ask me more than that, because I don't have the words for it yet, and I'm not sure I ever will. You're being foolish. Whatever's happened, we can set it right at breakfast, same as we've set everything right before." Thomas had looked at him then, and there was something in his younger brother's face that Colt did not recognize, something hollowed out and ashamed, though of what Colt could not have said even now, 8 years later. "Not this time," Thomas said. "This time it's already been set, Colt. Just not the way either of us would have chosen." He rode off before Colt could argue further, and Colt, still half asleep and certain his brother would cool off and return by supper, did not chase after him. That was the mistake Colt has replayed 1,000 times since. The morning he let pride and sleep and simple disbelief keep him standing in the yard instead of swinging up onto his own horse and riding after his brother to demand a real answer. He never got the chance again. By the time worry turned to real alarm, days had passed, and by the time alarm turned to searching, Thomas was already 3 counties gone, swallowed into a world Colt knew nothing about and, if he is honest with himself riding home tonight, never tried hard enough to find. The lesson sitting quietly under this chapter is a simple one. A wall built to keep pain out will just as surely keep love out too, and a man rarely notices the difference until something forces its way through anyway. The storm arrives from the west a little after 4 in the afternoon, rolling in fast the way storms do in this valley, turning a clear sky the color of a bruise inside of 20 minutes. Colt has seen enough weather to read it before it arrives, and he has already sent the hands to shelter the horses by the time the first hard rain hits the roof of the main house. He is settling in front of his own fire, a rare quiet evening with nothing but the crack of the storm outside, when he hears it. A knock, soft and then a little firmer, the knock of someone who has already tried knocking softer and been ignored by the weather itself. Colt opens the door expecting a hand caught out in the rain, or maybe a neighbor whose wagon threw a wheel. Instead he finds a woman standing on his porch, drenched from bonnet to boot, a leather travel bag clutched against her chest with one arm while the other holds a small child close against her shoulder, the little one somehow asleep despite the thunder rolling overhead. "I'm sorry to trouble you," she says, and her voice shakes, though whether from cold or nerves Colt cannot tell yet. "The road washed out a mile back. I saw your light." Colt looks past her at the rain, then back at her face, young but drawn thin with tiredness. He has turned away drifters before. He has turned away far more desperate people than this one standing on his porch, and he has slept fine every night after doing it. "Town's 4 miles on," he says. "In there'll take you in for the night." For miles I can't walk with a storm like this and a baby on my hip, she says. And there is no begging in it, just plain fact laid out between them. I'm not asking for charity, mister. I'm asking for a dry corner until this passes. Colt starts to close the door. He has said no to better-dressed men with better arguments than hers, and he tells himself this is no different. Then lightning splits the sky directly overhead, lighting up the porch bright as noon for one long second. And in that second Colt sees something dangling from a cord around her neck, tucked halfway into her collar. A small carved horse, rough cut, the kind a boy might whittle for someone he loved. Colt knows that carving. He knows it because he watched his own brother make it years ago, sitting on the corral fence with a pocket knife and more patience than skill. His hand freezes on the door. "Where did you get that?" he says, and his voice comes out rougher than he means it to. The woman's fingers go to the carving without thinking, the way a person touches something they have touched 1,000 times before for comfort. "This was given to me," she says carefully, watching his face change. "By my husband, Thomas." The name lands in Colt's chest like a dropped stone. "Thomas Bannerman," she says when he does not move, "was your brother, wasn't he?" For a long moment Colt says nothing at all. The rain keeps falling. The child stirs against the woman's shoulder and goes still again. Colt looks at the leather bag in her arms and sees, just visible at the top where it has not been buckled all the way shut, the folded corner of a paper gone soft with age, sealed once in wax that has long since cracked. He steps back from the door, not in welcome exactly, more in the way a man steps back from a fire he did not expect to still be burning. "You'd better come in," he says, "before you both catch your death out there." She steps over the threshold, and Colt Bannerman's carefully built silence, 3 years in the making, cracks for the first time since his brother rode away and never came home. He builds up the fire without being asked, fetches dry blankets from the cedar chest his mother once kept linens in, and sets a kettle on for tea before he has fully decided in his own mind why he is doing any of it. Josie thanks him quietly each time, watching him with an expression he cannot quite place, something between gratitude and caution, the look of a woman who has learned the hard way that kindness sometimes comes with a price attached. "You don't have to fuss over us," she says, settling into the chair nearest the fire with Ellie still sleeping against her. "Not fussing," Colt says, though the word does not sit easily on his own tongue either. "Just seeing you dry and warm is the same as I'd want done for me, caught out in weather like that." He sits across from her a while, neither of them speaking, the fire cracking and the storm rattling the shutters outside. Colt studies the rise and fall of the sleeping child's breathing, studies the way Josie's hand rests protective over the girl's back even in stillness, and feels something shift loose in his chest that he does not have a name for yet, something he has not felt since long before his brother rode away. He thinks, sitting there, that he has spent 3 years believing silence was the same thing as peace. Watching this stranger and her child breathe easy by his own fire, he is no longer certain the two were ever the same thing at all. The lesson under this chapter is simple, though Colt is nowhere near ready to hear it yet. The past does not knock politely and wait for permission. It arrives in the middle of the worst storm, holding the one thing you cannot turn away, and it asks you to be braver than you have been in years. Colt gives them the small guest room at the end of the hall, the one that has not held a guest in longer than he can remember. He tells himself it is one night only, a roof against the storm and nothing more, the same courtesy he would show any stranger caught out in weather like this. He tells himself that while he lays an extra blanket over the child's small shoulders without being asked, and while he finds himself listening for the woman's footsteps long after the house has gone quiet. Her name, she tells him over a supper neither of them eats much of, is Josephine Marsh. Josie, mostly. The child is Ellie, not yet 2 years old, and fast asleep before the meal is finished. "Thomas never told me much about this ranch," Josie says, turning a spoon in a bowl of stew she has barely touched. "Only that it was the finest land in 3 counties, and that his brother was too stubborn to see anything else in the world besides it." Colt's jaw tightens. "That's so." "He wasn't unkind about it," she says quickly. "Thomas loved you. Talk about you like you hung the moon, even after everything." "After everything," Colt repeats quietly. Josie sets the spoon down. You don't know, do you? What happened to him? Where he went? I know he rode off one morning without a word and never came back, Colt says. I know men told me later he died somewhere south of here, and I know I stopped asking questions after that, because the answers weren't going to change anything. Josie is quiet for a long moment, studying his face in the firelight. He didn't die riding south, she says finally. He ran off this land, Colt, told to leave and never come back, told his own father had disowned him and cut him out of every acre he was born to. He carried a letter that said as much for the rest of his life, folded so many times it nearly fell apart in his coat pocket. Colt feels something cold settle low in his stomach. That letter's a lie. My father never disowned Thomas. Whatever quarrel they had, it never went that far. I believed him, Josie says simply. I married him believing it. We had 4 good years together before the fever took him last winter. And in all that time he never once stopped believing his own family had thrown him away for nothing. The fire pops in the silence that follows. Colt stares into it, turning over 4 years of a life he never knew his brother lived. A wife he never met. A child who shares his own blood and does not know his name. Why come here now, he asks. After all this time. Josie reaches into the travel bag at her feet and draws out the folded paper Colt glimpsed on the porch, handling it the careful way a person handles something they have protected across a very long road. Because Ellie deserves to know where she comes from, she says. And because this paper isn't what Thomas was always told it was. I only found that out myself, going through his things after he passed. I think somebody lied to him, Colt. I think somebody lied to both of you. She slides the paper across the table. Colt does not open it yet. He sits with his hand flat on top of it instead, feeling the old wax seal beneath his palm, and for the first time in 3 years he lets himself remember his brother's face clearly, laughing on the corral fence with a half-carved horse in his hands. Later, with Ellie asleep and the fire burned down to low coals, Josie tells him more, unprompted. The way a person finally speaks once they have decided a listener can be trusted with the truth. I met Thomas in a rail town 2 counties south, she says. He was working a livery stable, quiet, kept to himself, same as you do now if I had to guess. Took me the better part of a year to get more than 10 words out of him at a stretch. Sounds like him, Colt says. Sounds like both of us, maybe more than I'd like to admit. He courted me slowly, Josie says, a small, sad smile touching her mouth. Brought me wildflowers he'd clearly picked in a hurry on his way into town. Half of them already wilted. Never had much money. But he never once made me feel poor for wanting so little of it myself. She pauses, turning her wedding band slowly around her finger. He used to say the only inheritance that mattered to him anymore was the one he was going to build with his own 2 hands, since the one he was born to had already been taken from him. I didn't understand what he meant by that until I found this deed folded in his old coat, going through his things after the fever took him. Colt is quiet a long moment, picturing his brother in a livery stable 2 counties south, alone, carrying a story about their family that was never true, and building an entire life on top of that false grief. He should have written to me, Colt says, and there is real pain in it now, not anger. Whatever he believed, he should have given me the chance to tell him otherwise. Would you have believed him? Josie asks gently. If he'd come back and told you Draven forged your father's signature, or would 3 years of grief already have you certain he was lying? Same as you were certain these last 3 years that reaching out to anyone at all wasn't worth the risk. Colt does not answer right away, because he does not like the honest answer sitting in his own chest. The lesson resting quietly in this chapter is one grief teaches slowly. The story we accept about the people we have lost is not always the true one, and sometimes healing begins only when we are brave enough to ask what really happened instead of settling for the version that hurt the least to believe. Word travels fast in a valley this small, faster still when it concerns the Bannerman ranch. By the second morning, Silas Draven's buggy is coming up the drive before Colt has finished his coffee, and Colt does not need to guess who told him a woman and child were staying under his roof. Silas steps down smiling, same as always, hat tipped back, the picture of a friendly neighbor calling on friendly business. He has been calling on Colt this way for 2 years now, ever since he took over financing half the ranches in the valley and started buying up the other half outright. Heard you took in some travelers, Silas says, glancing toward the house. Awfully generous. For a man who won't sell so much as a fence post to men offering real money. Storm caught them out, Colt says. Nothing more to it. Silas's eyes drift past Colt to the porch, where Josie has just stepped out with Ellie balanced on her hip, airing a blanket in the morning sun. Colt watches something shift behind Silas's easy smile. Something quick and sharp that vanishes almost before it shows itself, but not quite fast enough. That's a face I don't believe I've seen before, Silas says, too casual by half. New to the valley? Passing through, Josie says, before Colt can answer for her, her voice even and careful. Passing through, Silas repeats, and there is something in the way he says it, testing the words like a man checking a fence for weak posts. He tips his hat to her, climbs back into his buggy, and rides off without pressing the matter further, which unsettles Colt more than if he had pressed it hard. You know that man, Josie says once the buggy is well down the drive. Silas Draven. Holds paper on half the ranches in this valley, mine included, going back to a loan my father took years back to get us through a bad winter. I've been paying it down since I was 22 years old. Josie's face goes pale in a way Colt does not understand yet. Draven, she says slowly. Thomas mentioned that name. Only once, and only when he'd had too much to drink to guard his tongue. Said it like a curse. Colt turns to look at her fully. What did he say? I don't remember the exact words, only that it scared him to say the name sober, and that he never said it again after that one time. That night, long after Josie and Ellie have gone to bed, Colt sits alone with the folded deed Josie gave him, reading it by lamplight for the third time. It is old, the ink faded, but the terms are plain enough to any man who grew up reading ranch paper the way other men read scripture. It names Thomas Bannerman as inheritor of the Eastern Range, a full quarter of the ranch, signed by their father's hand and witnessed by a name Colt does not recognize. It is not the paper Colt was shown the week his father died, the one that left the entire ranch to Colt alone and named Thomas disinherited for reasons never fully explained to him. Colt remembers that paper clearly, remembers Silas Draven standing at his father's graveside offering to help settle the estate, offering the very loan that has kept Colt paying down debt to the man for 8 years running. He sets the lamp down and rubs a hand over his tired eyes, thinking of Silas Draven's easy smile on the porch that morning, the too casual way he had studied Josie's face. A man like that does not forget a face he has cause to fear, and Colt suspects, sitting alone with these two conflicting papers, that Silas Draven has every cause in the world to fear the woman currently sleeping down the hall in his guest room. He thinks of waking Josie right then to ask her plainly whether she means to stay long enough to see this through, or whether the wiser course for her and Ellie both would be to move on quietly before Draven decides a woman with proof of his crimes is more trouble alive than gone. He decides against waking her. Whatever choice she makes, he tells himself, it should be hers to make in daylight, with a clear head, not dragged half asleep into a decision she has not had time to weigh. For the first time, a question rises in Colt's chest that he does not want to ask, because he already fears he knows part of the answer. What if the paper he trusted for 8 years was the lie, and the paper folded in Josie's travel bag was the truth all along? He goes over the ledger of his own memory that night, every visit Draven has made to the ranch across 8 years, every friendly word offered alongside every payment collected, and finds, now that he is finally looking, a pattern he never once let himself see clearly before. Draven always arrived smiling. Draven always mentioned gently, almost as a kindness, how much easier Colt's life would be without the burden of the loan. How a man in Colt's position might consider selling off a parcel or two just to breathe easier. Colt had always refused, proud of his own stubbornness, never once wondering why a banker so eager to be repaid seemed equally eager to keep the debt alive rather than see it settled outright. 8 years. Colt says under his breath, alone in the study with the lamp burning low. And I never once asked why a man so hungry for money never pushed harder to collect the whole of it at once. The answer, he now understands, was never about the money at all. It was about keeping Colt exactly where he was, indebted, isolated, and far too proud to ask the kind of question that might have unraveled the whole arrangement years sooner. He does ask her, the following morning, over coffee neither of them drinks quickly. Draven recognized something in your face yesterday. Colt tells her plainly. I won't pretend otherwise. If you and Ellie want to move on before this turns dangerous, I'll see you safely to wherever you choose. No hard feelings and no questions asked. Josie considers this a long moment, watching Ellie play with a wooden spoon on the kitchen floor, entirely unaware of the weight being decided above her head. Thomas ran from this valley once already, she says finally. Ran scared, believing there was nothing here worth fighting for. I watched what carrying that belief did to him for 4 years, Colt. I won't teach Ellie to run from the same fight before she's even old enough to understand what it cost her father not to stay and face it. It could turn dangerous, Colt says again, plainer still. More dangerous than a cut water channel. I know it, Josie says. I'm staying anyway. This is Ellie's land every bit as much as it's yours, and I'll be flattered rather than frightened to see myself scared halfway across the country by a man who's already stolen enough from this family. Colt studies her for a long moment, something like respect settling behind his eyes. Then we'll face it together, he says. Same as we should have faced it 8 years ago, if either of us had known enough to try. The lesson threading through this chapter is one every person eventually meets. The man who smiles the widest and offers help the fastest in your worst moment is not always your friend. And grief makes us trust badly, precisely when we most need to trust well. Colt does not sleep that night. By first light, he has ridden the 6 miles into town to the small records office kept by an aging clerk named Whitmore, a man who has filed every deed and every death certificate in the valley for 30 years and remembers most of them without needing to check his ledgers. Bannerman Estate, Whitmore says, pulling the file without much trouble. Settled the year your father passed. I recall it well enough, seeing as Silas Draven himself walked the paperwork through my office personally. Said he was doing it as a kindness to a grieving family. Show me the original filing, Colt says. Not the copy. The original. Whitmore obliges, and Colt spreads 2 documents side by side on the counter. The one Whitmore's office has kept on file for 8 years, and the one folded in his coat pocket, carried across half a country by a woman who never stopped believing her husband deserved better than what he was told. The signatures do not match. Colt has seen his father's signature 1,000 times, on bills of sale, on letters, on the fence agreements with neighboring ranches. The signature on the office copy is close enough to fool a grieving son too heartbroken at 24 to look twice, but it is not right. The loop on the B curls the wrong direction. His father never made that mistake in 30 years of signing his own name. Who witnessed this filing? Colt asks, though he already suspects the answer. Whitmore checks the ledger. Draven himself signed as witness. Common enough, given he was handling the estate. Whitmore lowers his voice before Colt leaves the office, glancing toward the window as though Draven's men might be listening from the street outside. Careful how loud you carry this, Colt, the old clerk says. Draven's got friends in the capital same as he's got friends here. Men who owe him favors bigger than a filing clerk's salary can refuse. You go accusing him plain before you've got a judge already lined up to hear it. You're liable to find yourself in more danger than you bargained for. I appreciate the warning, Colt says, folding both papers carefully into his coat. But I've spent 8 years being careful how loud I carry things. Careful is what lets this stand as long as it has. Whitmore nods slowly, a man who understands the weight of what Colt is about to do better than most. Then I'll have my ledger ready when a judge comes asking, he says. That much I can promise you, whatever comes of the rest. Colt rides back to the ranch with both papers folded together in his coat. His jaw set in a way Deke recognizes from 3 miles off and knows better than to comment on. He finds Josie in the garden with Ellie, and he lays both documents on the fence post between them without a word. Josie studies them both, then looks up at him. The signatures, she says slowly, don't match. Whoever forged the copy that disinherited Thomas wasn't careful enough about the one detail my father could never fake even if he tried. Colt's voice is rough, low, a man speaking a truth he does not want to be true. Silas Draven witnessed the false filing. Silas Draven has been collecting payment on my father's loan for 8 years. On land he helped steal from my own brother. Why would he do it? Josie asks, though her face suggests she already suspects. Because a young man runs off with nothing and a broken heart doesn't come back to fight for land, Colt says. But a full quarter of this ranch, held in trust, contested by 2 brothers instead of one clear owner, that's harder for Draven to buy quietly. He needed one owner. One man he could keep in debt long enough to eventually take the whole ranch when the debt finally broke him. Josie is quiet a long moment, watching Ellie pull at a handful of grass. Too young to know she is sitting on the very ground her father was cheated out of. Thomas believed his own family threw him away, she says finally. He carried that his whole life, changed him, made him quieter, sadder than the man I think he could have been. Colt looks down at the papers and for the first time in 3 years, something in his chest that has been locked tight since his brother rode away breaks open. Not in anger exactly, but in grief so old it has gone stale, finally given room to breathe. I let him go, Colt says quietly. I believed a lie about my own brother and I let him go. And I never once tried hard enough to find out why he really left. You didn't know, Josie says. I should have asked harder questions, Colt says. Same as I should be asking harder questions about Draven right now, instead of paying down debt to the man who stole from my family in the first place. The lesson resting in this chapter is one that costs Colt dearly to learn. Pride and grief make convenient blinders, and it is far easier to accept a painful story without question than to risk finding out the truth is even worse, and that we ourselves share some blame for not looking sooner. Silas Draven does not wait long once he understands what Colt has found. Within the week, the ranch's main water channel, the one feeding every trough from the north pasture to the home corral, turns up choked with rock and cut brush a mile upstream, in a place no natural flood would ever reach. Somebody did this on purpose, Deke says, standing ankle-deep in the dry channel bed, wiping sweat from his brow though the morning is barely warm yet. Somebody sent a message, Colt says. Draven knows I've seen the real deed. This is him telling me he's not afraid of a piece of paper. 2 ranch hands quit within the same week, spooked by a visit from men Deke does not recognize. Men who talked low and vague about accidents that happen on ranches with unclear ownership. Colt does not blame the hands for leaving. A working man cannot afford to gamble his safety on another family's fight, and Colt tells them so plainly when they collect their final pay. It is Bertie Calloway who brings the clearest warning, arriving at the ranch gate in her own wagon one evening with flour still dusted on her apron from the day's baking. Bertie has run the boarding house in town for 15 years, has fed half of Draven's hired men their supper at one time or another, and hears more truth over a plate of stew than most men hear in a courtroom. Draven's been talking to men who aren't ranch hands, she tells Colt, standing in his own kitchen with her arms crossed tight. Men who carry themselves like they've done worse work than mending fences. He's paying them out of his own pocket, not through the bank, which tells me he doesn't want a paper trail on this particular business. Saying what? Colt asks. Saying the Bannerman Ranch has an ownership dispute that needs settling quietly before it reaches a judge in the capital, Bertie says. Saying it needs settling before harvest, one way or another. Colt looks at Josie across the kitchen, holding Ellie against her hip, and feels the shape of the coming danger settle over the house like a second storm building behind the first one. He means to run us off, Colt says. Same as he ran off Thomas 8 years back. Only this time he can't count on a young man too heartbroken to fight. Can he do it? Josie asks. Legally, I mean. No, Colt says, which is exactly why he won't try it legally. Bertie sets a hand on Josie's arm, the gesture of a woman who has weathered plenty of hard seasons of her own and recognizes fear when she sees it sitting on another woman's shoulders. You're not alone out here, whatever Draven wants you to believe, Bertie says. This valley remembers who its friends are, and it remembers who Silas Draven really is, even if it's been too scared to say so out loud until now. Before she leaves, Bertie lingers a moment at the door, looking back at Josie and Ellie by the fire. My own husband crossed Draven once, years back, over a small parcel Draven wanted cheap, she says quietly. Nothing burned down that time, only a bad fall from a spooked horse that nobody could ever quite explain. I've kept my head down around that man for a decade since, telling myself it wasn't my fight to pick. She pauses, jaw tight. I'm done keeping my head down, Colt. You send word if trouble comes, any hour, and I'll have this whole town at your gate before you finish saying his name. Colt walks her out to her wagon himself, grateful in a way he does not have easy words for. Why help us now, he asks, when you've stayed clear of him this long? Because watching a woman and a baby get threatened out of a home that's rightfully theirs is a different thing than watching a grown man lose a bad bargain, Bertie says simply. Some lines a person only finds once somebody finally crosses them plain enough to see. Deke finds Colt in the barn the next morning, oiling his father's old shotgun with a care he has not shown the weapon in years. Are you planning for a war or a nuisance? Deke asks, leaning against the doorframe. Planning for whichever one Draven decides to bring, Colt says. Rather be ready for the war and get the nuisance instead than the other way around. The men who are left will stand with you, Deke says. Tell them plainly what we're facing, and not one of them packed a bag last night. Figured you ought to know that, before things get worse. Colt looks up from the shotgun, something briefly unguarded crossing his face. Didn't expect that, he admits. Didn't expect a lot of what's happened around here lately, Deke says. Man who wouldn't sell a fence post 3 years running. Taking in a widow and a baby and standing up to Silas Draven inside of 2 weeks. Valley's talking about it plenty, and not unkindly whatever else you might be imagining. That night Colt walks the fence line himself, lantern in hand, checking every post and every gate the way his father taught him. The way he has done 1,000 nights before. But tonight he is not just checking for broken fences. He is counting the ways in, the places a man with bad intentions might come at the house unseen, and for the first time since Thomas rode away, Colt Bannerman is not preparing to defend land alone. He is preparing to defend a family he did not know he still had. The lesson quietly built into this chapter is one small town understands better than most. Fear kept silent lets cruelty grow unchecked, but the same fear, spoken honestly between neighbors, becomes the beginning of real courage. With the water channel fouled and 2 hands gone, Colt makes a decision he would have laughed off a month earlier. He teaches Josie to shoot. It starts plain enough, out behind the barn where Ellie naps safely indoors under Bertie's watchful eye. Colt sets 3 tin cans on the corral fence and hands Josie an old rifle that belonged to his father, showing her how to brace the stock against her shoulder, how to breathe out slowly before she pulls the trigger instead of holding her breath and flinching. Thomas never once let me near a gun, Josie admits, missing her first 3 shots badly. Said it wasn't a woman's business. Thomas was wrong about a few things, it turns out, Colt says, and there is no bitterness in it now, only something close to fondness for a brother he is only beginning to understand. This is your land too, whether Draven wants to admit it or not. A person ought to know how to protect what's theirs. By the 4th try, Josie clips the edge of a can, and by the 10th, she is hitting 2 out of 3 clean. Colt finds himself watching her more than the cans, the fierce concentration on her face, the way she squares her shoulders the same stubborn way Thomas used to before a hard day's work. You remind me of him, Colt says, before he quite means to say it out loud. Not in your aim. In this way you plant your feet and don't move them again once you've decided something. Josie lowers the rifle, studying him. Is that a kind thing to say, or an unkind one? Kindest thing I know how to say these days, Colt admits. Something passes between them in that moment, quiet and unspoken. The first easy silence Colt has felt with another living soul in longer than he can remember. It is not romance yet, not fully, but it is the ground romance grows from. 2 people who have both been let down by the world finding, almost by accident, that they trust each other more than they expected to. They spend the following days reinforcing the house instead of the fences, boarding the lower windows, moving feed and water stores into the cellar, positioning lanterns where they will do the most good if trouble comes after dark. Deke and the 2 remaining hands work alongside them without complaint, because whatever fear Draven's hired men stirred up in town, it has not touched the loyalty these particular men hold for Colt Bannerman. One evening, working side by side nailing a board over a low window, Josie's hand brushes Colt's, and neither of them pulls away as quickly as either would have a week earlier. I didn't come here looking for this, Josie says quietly, meaning more than just the boarded windows. Neither did I, Colt says. Didn't think I had room left in me for any of it. And now, Colt looks at her for a long moment, the hammer still in his hand, the last light of evening catching the tired lines of her face and somehow making them beautiful instead of simply weary. Now I think I've had less room in me than I ought to have allowed, he says. For a lot of things. Not just you. They did not kiss that evening. It is not the time for it, with danger closing in from every direction and a child asleep in the next room. But something settles between them all the same, quiet and certain, the understanding that whatever comes in the fight ahead, they intend to face it standing together rather than standing apart. Later, after the house has gone dark and Ellie is long asleep, Colt finds himself sitting on the porch steps where Josie first knocked, unable to settle his mind enough for sleep. He is not surprised, somehow, when the door opens quietly behind him and Josie steps out to join him, a shawl pulled around her shoulders against the night chill. Couldn't sleep either, she says, settling beside him on the step, close enough that their shoulders nearly touch. Keep thinking on my brother, Colt admits, wondering what he'd make of all this. His wife and his daughter, sitting on his own brother's porch, teaching each other to be brave enough to hold this land he never got the chance to claim himself. I think he'd be glad, Josie says. Not for the danger, but for this part. You finally letting somebody past that fence you've built around yourself. Colt looks over at her in the dark, the moon just enough to catch the line of her face. Thomas always did have better instincts than me about people, he says. Maybe it's time I started trusting his judgment on at least one thing, even if it took me 8 years and a burned water channel to get there. Josie laughs softly, the first real laugh Colt has heard from her since the storm brought her to his door, and the sound of it settles something in him more thoroughly than any silence ever has. Whatever happens with Draven, she says, sobering, I'm glad the storm brought us here. Glad. Even knowing what it's cost us both already. So am I, Colt says, and means it more plainly than he has meant anything in a very long while. The lesson resting in this chapter is a gentle one, easy to miss beside the louder danger building around it. Real partnership is rarely built in easy seasons. It is built in the hard ones, when two people choose to stand shoulder to shoulder instead of turning away from each other's trouble. The attack comes on the 4th night after the water channel was fouled, under a sky black with clouds and no moon to betray the men creeping across the north pasture. Colt hears the horses first, more of them than any honest visitor would bring after dark, and he is at the window with his father's shotgun before the first torch touches the old stable roof. Josie cellar now, he says, already moving, and she does not argue, scooping Ellie from her crib and disappearing down the cellar stairs with a speed that tells Colt she has been dreading and preparing for this exact moment as much as he has. The stable catches fast, dry timber and old hay going up in a roar that lights the whole yard orange. And in that ugly light Colt counts 8 men fanning out toward the house, Silas Draven notably absent, keeping his own boots clean the way such men always do while other men take the risk on his behalf. Deke takes a graze along his forearm early in the fight, cursing loud enough for Colt to hear it even over the roar of the burning stable, but he does not leave his post at the corral fence, only wraps the wound tight with a bandana and keeps trading shots with the riders trying to press past him toward the house. The 2 remaining hands hold their ground beside him, younger men who have never faced gunfire before tonight, and Colt hears the fear in their voices between shots even as they refuse to break and run. Colt holds the front door alone, and it is there that Draven's men breach the front room with a boot to the door just as Colt levers another shell into the shotgun. Draven wants the deed. The lead man shouts over the roar of the fire outside. Hand it over and we ride off peacefully. Deeds in the capital by now, Colt lies steady, filed with a judge who doesn't answer to Silas Draven. Burning my stable won't unfile it. It is a bluff, but it lands hard enough to buy him a half-second of hesitation, and a half-second is all Colt needs to put himself squarely between the intruder and the cellar door, refusing to give ground even with a rifle leveled at his own chest. He thinks, in the strange clear way a man thinks in danger, of his brother riding off the same yard 8 years ago, alone and believing nobody would fight for him. Colt is done letting Bannerman blood face this valley's cruelty alone. Down in the cellar, Josie presses Ellie tight against her chest with one arm and holds the old rifle steady with the other, watching the door at the top of the stairs, praying it stays shut, ready if it does not. It is Birdie who tips the fight, arriving with half the town behind her wagon, roused from their beds by a message Josie managed to send at first sign of trouble days earlier, a note carried quietly into town by the youngest ranch hand under cover of dusk. Neighbors who have quietly resented Silas Draven for years, but lacked the courage to say so alone, find that courage together, riding up the drive with lanterns and shotguns, and a resolve that 8 years of quiet fear finally breaks loose all at once. The tide turns fast once outnumbered men realize they are outnumbered themselves. Draven's hired guns scatter into the dark rather than face an entire township, and the fire at the stable is beaten back to smoking ruin before it can reach the house. A lost Colt will grieve later but does not have time to grieve tonight. Colt finds Josie and Ellie safe in the cellar, both trembling, both alive, and for a long moment he simply holds them both against his chest without a single word needing to be said. Outside, the yard is a strange, smoking quiet after the noise of the fight, neighbors moving between the wounded and the frightened, someone already drawing water to douse the last stubborn flames licking at the stable's ruined frame. Birdie finds Josie first, pulling her into a tight embrace before she has even fully climbed out of the cellar, checking Ellie over with the practiced hands of a woman who has tended to plenty of frightened children in her time. "You're safe," Birdie says over and over, as much to steady her own nerves as Josie's. "You're safe now, both of you, and this valley isn't about to let anybody take that from you again." Deke's wound proves shallow once Colt looks it over properly by lantern light, though the foreman grumbles the whole while about ruining a perfectly good shirt for a scratch not worth the fuss. The two young hands stand a little taller than they did at sundown, having faced real danger for the first time and found, to their own quiet surprise, that they had the courage for it after all. The lesson burning through this chapter, clear as the flames that nearly took the stable, is that courage rarely wins alone. It took a whole valley finally choosing bravery together to turn back what one greedy man believed he could take by force, and no one family should ever have to face real cruelty entirely by itself. Silas Draven does not run far. He tries, riding hard for the Capitol Road at first light once word reaches him that his hired men scattered and his plan burned down along with the stable. But Colt knows this valley better than any man alive, knows every shortcut and creek crossing Draven would need to slip past unseen, and he is waiting at the corral gate on the old Millbrook Trail when Draven's horse comes around the bend. "Bannerman," Draven says, forcing his old easy smile even now, though it does not reach his eyes. "I imagine there's been some misunderstanding at your place." "No misunderstanding," Colt says, and he holds up both documents, side by side, the forged filing and the true deed, close enough for Draven to see clearly in the morning light. Just a forged signature and 8 years of stolen debt payments. And a whole valley of witnesses who watched your hired men burn my stable last night trying to bury the proof. Draven's smile finally slips. "You've got no judge out here who'll take a rancher's word over mine. I've got Whitmore's original ledger, a signature that doesn't match my father's hand in a way any clerk can verify, and half the township ready to swear to what they saw last night," Colt says. "I've also got a widow and a child who are the rightful owners of a quarter of this ranch you tried to steal from my brother 8 years back. That's considerably more than your word alone, Draven." Behind Colt, Deke and 3 other ranch hands ride up quiet, unhurried, simply present, the way men present themselves when they intend a thing to end peacefully but are ready for it not to. Draven looks at the numbers arrayed against him and understands, for the first time in a long while, that his money and his smile are not going to be enough this time. The capital judge arrives within the fortnight, summoned by Whitmore himself once the forged signature is laid plain against the original ledger. Silas Draven is stripped of the loan paper he has held over the Bannerman Ranch for 8 years. Stripped further of every other loan he has been quietly using to squeeze smaller ranches across the valley, and marched off toward a circuit court that will have considerably less patience for his smile than the valley ever did. The circuit judge holds hearings in the town hall, the only room large enough to seat the number of townsfolk who turn out to see the matter settled properly. Whitmore presents his original ledger without hesitation, laying the mismatched signatures side by side for the judge's own eyes. Birdie testifies plainly about the hired men Draven paid outside the bank's books, and 3 of the neighbors who rode to the ranch the night of the fire stand and swear to what they saw with their own eyes, no longer afraid to say Draven's name out loud in a public room. Draven, for his part, tries every argument a clever man can muster, claiming the original ledger was itself in error, claiming Colt and Josie had conspired together to forge a false deed of their own. But the judge has seen enough forged paper in his year's writing circuit to recognize the genuine article when it is set plainly before him, and the weight of a whole valley's testimony proves more than any single clever argument can overturn. Mr. Draven, the judge says at last, it is the finding of this court that the estate filing of 8 years past was fraudulent, entered by your own hand and witnessed falsely by the same. The loan held against the Bannerman Ranch is voided in full, effective immediately, and the eastern quarter named in the true deed is restored to the rightful heir. A murmur of satisfaction moves through the crowded hall, and Colt feels Josie's hand find his own beneath the table, gripping tight. Colt stands at the corral fence some days later watching the last of Draven's confiscated papers carried off toward the capital, feeling something loosen in his chest that has been clenched tight since the morning his father died and Draven first stepped forward, smiling, offering to help settle the estate. It's done, Josie says, coming to stand beside him. Ellie balanced on her hip, watching the same wagon disappear down the road. Before the wagon carries him off toward the circuit court entirely, Draven asks for one private word with Colt, and Colt, against Deke's muttered advice, grants it. You'll rebuild that stable and plant your apple trees and think yourself righteous for it. Draven says through the wagon bars, his old smile gone entirely now, replaced by something thinner and more bitter. But you'll never know what it cost me to build what I built in this valley, starting with nothing, same as your brother started with nothing when he rode off. The difference is, I didn't wait around for somebody to hand me a fair inheritance. You didn't build anything, Colt says evenly. You stole it piece by piece, from families too grieving or too trusting to look twice at your paperwork. That's not the same as building, Draven. That's just taking, and calling it clever because nobody caught you sooner. Draven has no answer for that, and the wagon rolls on without another word passing between them. 8 years, Colt says quietly, turning back toward Josie. 8 years I paid a thief for land he stole from my own brother, and I never once thought to ask a harder question. You're asking them now, Josie says. That's what matters. Colt looks down at her and then at Ellie, who reaches up without warning and grabs a fistful of his shirt collar the way small children do, entirely unconcerned with the weight of the history surrounding her. Something in Colt's chest, guarded for 3 long years, finally settles into something like peace. The lesson standing plain in this chapter is one worth carrying past the final page. Justice rarely arrives quickly, and it rarely arrives alone, but a lie built on greed cannot stand forever against patient, careful truth, especially once enough honest people finally choose to stand together against it. Spring comes to Bannerman Ranch differently than any spring Colt can remember. The stable is rebuilt by early planting season, every hand in the valley pitching in to raise the new timber frame in a single week. Neighbors who once kept their heads down around Draven, now showing up with hammers and good humor, and no debt owed to anyone but each other. The eastern quarter of the ranch, the range named in Thomas's true deed, is formally reorganized before the circuit judge, restored to Ellie's name in trust, with Josie holding guardianship until the girl comes of age. Colt insists on it plainly, in front of Whitmore and the judge both, refusing any argument that his brother's daughter deserves anything less than what was always rightfully hers. Half this valley thinks you've gone soft, Deke says one evening, watching Colt help Josie plant a row of young apple trees along the eastern fence line, exactly where Thomas once talked of building a house of his own someday. Maybe I have, Colt says, setting a sapling gently into its hole. Spending 3 years thinking hard was the only way to survive out here. Turns out I was surviving. I wasn't living. Josie straightens from her own planting, brushing dirt from her hands, watching him with an expression that has grown steadily warmer across the changing seasons. Your brother would be glad to see this land finally settled fair, she says. Gladder still to see his daughter growing up somewhere she belongs, instead of somewhere she's only passing through. And her mother? Colt asks, stepping closer. Where does she belong? Josie does not answer with words right away. She answers by closing the small distance between them herself, and when Colt kisses her there among the young apple trees, it is not the hesitant, careful thing it might have been a season earlier. It is certain, and it is chosen, two people who have both lost enough to know exactly what they do not want to lose again. They marry before the first snow, a small gathering on the porch where Josie first knocked, Birdie standing witness with flour still faintly dusted on her good dress, Deke in the hands raising a toast that would have embarrassed Colt terribly a year earlier and now only makes him laugh. Whitmore rides out from town for the ceremony too, bringing with him the original ledger as a gift of sorts, a copy made for Colt's own records so the true history of the land would never again rest on a single fragile paper hidden in someone's coat. Colt thanks him plainly, and means it, understanding now how close the truth came to being lost forever in a filing cabinet nobody thought to question. Josie wears a simple dress for the wedding, nothing fine or fussy, because neither of them has ever cared much for show, and standing there on the porch with the whole valley gathered below, exchanging vows before a traveling preacher while Ellie toddles happily between the rows of well-wishers, Colt Bannerman thinks it is the finest sight he has ever witnessed on land he once believed could only ever be defended, never truly shared. Ellie grows up knowing two names for home instead of one, running barefoot between the main house and the eastern range her father once dreamed of building on, never once doubting that she belongs to this land every bit as much as her uncle does. Colt tells her stories of Thomas some evenings, the real ones now, not the ones softened or hidden out of old grief, and watches something in the girl's face light up every time she hears her father described as brave instead of merely gone. Standing on his porch some evenings, watching Josie chase Ellie laughing across the yard while the sun goes down gold over land that finally belongs, honestly and fairly, to everyone who has a true claim on it, Colt Bannerman no longer feels like a fortress standing guard against the world. He feels, for the first time since he was a young man laughing at his own supper table, like a home. Years from now, when Ellie is old enough to ask her own hard questions, Colt intends to answer every one of them honestly, starting with the true story of the storm that brought her mother to his door, and ending with the plain truth that courage, once found, tends to multiply rather than run out. He no longer believes a ranch this size needs to be defended by one hardened man standing alone behind barbed wire. He has learned, the hard way, that it is far better defended by a family willing to stand together, and a valley willing to stand beside them. The final lesson this story leaves behind is simple enough for anyone to carry forward. The walls we build to protect ourselves from being hurt again will also keep out the very love and belonging we are secretly starving for, and sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is answer the door, even during the worst storm of their life, and find out who is standing on the other side.